The sky was gray, the kind of gray that hangs heavy, turning the city into a backdrop of quiet tension. As Jasmine Crockett walked into Courtroom 2A, her mind was already set on the usual. A quick procedural check, maybe a couple of motions, a few lines of back and forth between attorneys, a formality, no big deal. But something about the air in the room made her pause. The usual hum of conversation, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of anticipation before a case was called, all of it was missing. Courtroom 2A, usually buzzing with activity, felt unnervingly still, almost as if the very room itself had swallowed all the noise and secrets it had witnessed over the years. The clerk behind the counter refused to make eye contact, her fingers clicking over the keyboard with a practiced speed that didn't quite match the tension in the room. The bailiff, who typically greeted attorneys with a nod or a friendly word, offered a tight-lipped smile and a curt nod as he moved to the side. Even the walls seemed to lean in closer, as if trying to hear what was happening next. Jasmine could feel the weight of it all, the pressure, the unspoken discomfort, and the unmistakable feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. At the bench, Judge Richard Monroe sat like a silent sentinel, his tall, imposing figure casting a long shadow over the courtroom. He was a man known for his cold efficiency, a judge who had built a career on expedient verdicts, often delivered with a level of detachment that bordered on disdain. His robes flowed like armor, as if the very fabric of the judicial system was there to shield him from any consequences of his rulings. There was no warmth in his gaze, no flicker of humanity behind his sharp eyes. He was a man who didn't need to be liked or even understood. He just needed to win, and his victories came at the expense of anyone unlucky enough to be caught in his crosshairs. Jasmine had been in the courtroom with Monroe more times than she could count. But today felt different. She had seen judges who ruled with bias, with arrogance, and with favoritism, but nothing quite like this. She could sense it in the air, like a storm on the horizon. There was something malicious here, something far deeper than a simple case. The judge didn't greet the room as he usually did. There were no pleasantries, no acknowledgement of the attorneys or the parties involved. He didn't even bother to glance at his notes before speaking. He just opened his mouth, and the words that came out were cold, sharp, and unforgiving. This matter is already clear. The defendant is in violation of Code 22F. The fine is $15,000 to be paid immediately. The words hit Jasmine like a slap in the face, ringing in her ears as if the court had just dropped a bombshell. Her body froze, her hands clenched involuntarily on the sides of her chair, the files still unopened before her. It was as if someone had just thrown the case out the window before it had even begun. No arguments, no review of evidence, no attempt at dialogue. Just a final, dismissive ruling, a decision that had been made before anyone had even entered the room. Jasmine's mind scrambled to make sense of it. She hadn't even had a chance to speak. No opening statements had been made. No legal arguments had been presented, and yet here she was, being slapped with a ruling that could have ruined her entire day and her entire case with a single decree. It didn't make sense. This wasn't how courtrooms were supposed to work. This wasn't even how any courtroom should work. Across the room, the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced over at Jasmine, confusion written all over his face. He hadn't expected this either. Monroe had always been known for his quick rulings, but this was something else entirely. There were no explanations, no preemptive questions, just an out-of-the-blue penalty, a fine delivered with the same ease as if it were an afterthought, as if the defendant wasn't even worthy of a hearing, just a cold, calculating decision, swift, clean, and without remorse. Jasmine's mind began to race. She was being silenced. She could feel it. It wasn't just the fine. It was the total disregard for due process, the blatant refusal to even acknowledge her existence as an attorney, as a professional, or as a person. It was a blatant power move. Monroe wasn't ruling based on law. He was ruling based on dominance. He wanted to remind everyone in the room, including Jasmine, of who was in charge. Her voice cut through the stillness of the room, controlled, deliberate, and firm. "Your Honor," she began, her eyes fixed on him, "I respectfully ask that you allow me the opportunity to present my defense. Due process requires that I be heard." There was no desperation in her voice, no pleading. Jasmine didn't ask for permission. She invoked the law. She was making a demand, one that no judge, no matter how powerful, could ignore without consequence. She knew what she was doing. She was forcing the issue. She was asserting her right to be heard, and that right was as much a part of the legal system as anything else. But Judge Monroe wasn't having it. His gaze didn't soften. It hardened. The ice in his eyes thickened, and his lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. He wasn't moved. His posture remained the same, stiff and imposing, as if his authority was unquestionable. "No," he snapped, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "None are needed. You violated the code." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as though he were delivering an edict, not a ruling. His eyes locked onto Jasmine's, unblinking. "Sit down. I won't entertain any speeches, Miss Crockett. You want to argue? Take it to appeals, if it gets that far." His words rang in the air like a death knell, and Jasmine could feel the weight of them, the weight of power wielded without accountability. Monroe wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in control. He didn't care about the law. He cared about showing everyone in that room that he could do whatever he wanted, and everyone had better fall in line. Jasmine stood there unmoving as the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she didn't look away from Monroe. Her expression remained calm, steady, despite the storm inside her. She wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. This wasn't just about her case. This was about something much bigger than that. This was about standing up to a system that thought it could bully people into silence. This was about making sure that her voice, and the voice of everyone who had ever been wronged by a corrupt system, would be heard, and she would make sure of it. Judge Monroe sat back in his chair, hands steepled, a quiet confidence radiating from him. He had dealt with attorneys like Jasmine before, cocky, self-assured, but ultimately powerless in the face of his authority. He was used to winning, and Jasmine, like so many others, was supposed to be another casualty of his well-practiced dominance. In his mind, the game was over. He had dealt his blow with the speed of an executioner's strike, and now it was just a matter of watching her crumble under the weight of the fine. But Jasmine Crockett didn't sit down. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She stood there, tall and unyielding, the kind of presence that filled a room without a single word. She locked eyes with Monroe, a calmness in her expression that seemed to contradict the chaos bubbling beneath the surface. Then, without a moment's hesitation, she reached into her briefcase, pulling out a thick folder and setting it down on the table. The movement was slow, deliberate. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't panicked. It was precise. Every motion measured, every movement calculated. This wasn't the action of a woman who was about to lose. This was the action of someone who had already won. She was simply letting the room catch up. That folder, Monroe realized, a split second too late, wasn't just a stack of papers. It was her counterstrike. Inside it was something he hadn't anticipated: precedent, rulings, records, receipts. Jasmine had come prepared, not for a battle, but for this exact ambush. She had studied the law and, more importantly, she had studied him. She had studied Judge Monroe's past decisions, the little patterns that he thought were hidden but were really just open secrets. Jasmine knew men like him, men who wore their power like a badge, but whose authority was as thin as paper. They didn't care about the law, not really. They cared about control, about maintaining their image. They believed that a single glance, a single ruling could crush anyone in their way, and most of the time they were right. But not today. Jasmine's fingers tightened around the top document, lifting it with the kind of precision that would have made a surgeon proud. She held it between two fingers, her gaze still unwavering, like she was preparing to drop a bomb in the room. "Your Honor," she began quietly, her voice slicing through the heavy air like a blade, "I'm submitting this for the record. You've cited Code 22F, but according to the appellate court's own clarification last October, that code doesn't apply in this situation." And with that, the room froze. It wasn't the gasp of shock that followed her words. It was a silence, a deep, tense stillness that settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. The air seemed to thin, and the weight of her words began to sink in, creeping into every corner of the room. Jasmine didn't break her eye contact with Monroe. She simply slid the document toward the bench, pushing it forward as if it were a loaded weapon. Monroe didn't reach for it. Instead, he sat there frozen, staring at the paper. The act of submission wasn't what threw him. It was the fact that Jasmine had just pulled the rug out from under him, exposing him for what he was. His eyes narrowed. His fingers drummed slowly on the bench in a rhythm that was almost imperceptible, but to anyone paying attention, it spoke volumes. He was searching for his next move, but the truth had already stolen the power he once held. "Furthermore," Jasmine continued, her voice calm, steady, and precise, "your own ruling in State versus. Randall contradicts your interpretation today." Boom. That was it. The shot across the bow. The courtroom could feel it. The shift in the atmosphere. The moment when everything Monroe had built up started to crack and crumble. This wasn't a defense. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was an execution of the truth. Jasmine wasn't here to beg. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply holding up the law, up to the light, up to scrutiny, up to the man who thought he could bend it to his will. And in doing so, she made him confront the very thing he was trying to avoid, the truth. And when the truth stared him in the face, it was all Monroe could do to sit there, mouth tight, eyes flicking between the paper in front of him and the woman who had just dared to expose him. Monroe's jaw clenched. The tightness of his face betrayed the effort it took for him to maintain his composure. For the first time since this case had started, he was the one on the defensive. His mind raced, but there was no escape from the reality of Jasmine's argument. Her words, like well-aimed bullets, were penetrating the fortress of his ego, and he couldn't stop it. His fingers drummed nervously on the bench, a habit that betrayed him. The silence in the room was heavy now, everyone watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. The clerk, who had been busy with paperwork moments ago, now looked up at the judge, her face drawn tight in anticipation. Even the other attorneys in the room had stopped what they were doing, drawn into the unfolding drama. Monroe's gaze never wavered from Jasmine's face, but the cracks were beginning to show. He wasn't the unshakable figure of power he had been just moments ago. He wasn't the judge who could dismiss anyone with a wave of his hand. In that moment, Jasmine had flipped the script. The balance of power had shifted. The law, something Monroe had long ignored when it suited him, was now standing tall in the room, refusing to be overlooked. The room could feel the weight of the change. There was something almost palpable in the air, a tension, an energy, a crackling sense of anticipation that left everyone waiting for what came next. But Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't push. She didn't raise her voice. She stood calm and composed, her posture unyielding. She wasn't here to bask in victory. She wasn't here for applause. She didn't need to shout to prove her point. When you had the truth, all you had to do was let it echo, and that's exactly what she did. She stood still, the silence now wrapping around her like a cloak, her eyes locked on Monroe's. She had done all she needed to do. The rest was up to him. Would he continue with the charade? Would he let his ego guide him down a path that would only make things worse? Or would he back down, admit his error, and, if only for a moment, let the law do its job? The answer was already clear. Jasmine had already won. She was just waiting for Monroe to figure it out. But he didn't. Not yet. The moment stretched on, the room hanging in the balance, every breath drawn in anticipation. Jasmine didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't break her gaze. She knew this game all too well. She had seen it played before, and in that moment, she knew she was on the verge of something much bigger than a courtroom win. She was about to shatter the illusion of invincibility that Judge Monroe had so carefully constructed. And when that happened, nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom was dead quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that invited contemplation or reflection. This wasn't the peaceful hush of a room waiting for an important statement. No, this was the kind of silence that preceded collapse, the kind that pressed against your eardrums and squeezed your chest. A judge had just been publicly checkmated in his own courtroom, and not by a superior, by a black woman he had underestimated from the very beginning. Monroe's face remained stoic, the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent decades honing the art of authority. But if you looked close enough, you could see it, the tension around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. It was subtle, but unmistakable. For all his experience, for all the power he had wielded in that courtroom, he wasn't used to resistance. Not this kind of resistance. He wasn't used to being called out in the middle of his own game, not by someone who didn't shout, didn't plead, but instead handed him his arrogance wrapped in legal precedent and surgical calm. In the world of judges and lawyers, silence is a weapon, and Jasmine had wielded it with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't rush, she didn't shout, she simply existed. And in that moment, she became the only thing that mattered in the room. Monroe had been blindsided, and now he was faced with a decision. Acknowledge the mistake and back down gracefully, or double down and risk setting the entire courtroom on fire. He was a proud man, a man who thought his dominance was unquestionable. But pride has a way of blinding people to the truth. The choice he made would determine whether the flames consumed him or whether he could extinguish them before they grew too hot. He chose fire. Without touching the folder Jasmine had handed him, Monroe leaned forward, the motion sharp and deliberate. "Ms. Crockett," he began, his voice cold and clipped, "I will remind you that this is my courtroom. Your tone, your tactics, they border on contempt. That was it. No rebuttal of the documents, no attempt to correct his misinterpretation of the law, no acknowledgement of the glaring hole in his judgment, just a thinly veiled threat, a last-ditch effort to maintain control. He was no longer arguing the law, he was defending his own ego. He knew, deep down, that he had lost. He could feel it in the air, the oppressive weight of the truth pressing down on him, but his pride, his need to maintain authority, was too much to let go of. The law had ceased to matter. In that moment, only his ego stood between him and the inevitable. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't react with anger, nor did she raise her voice. Instead, she simply repeated the word he had thrown at her, turning it over in her mouth like a bitter pill. "Contempt," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. Interesting choice of words. And then she did the unthinkable. She opened another folder. This one was thicker. He could see it immediately, the difference in weight, the weight of the information inside. This wasn't just a defense, it was a dossier. This was the moment when everything Monroe had built came crashing down, piece by piece. What Jasmine held now wasn't about the case at hand. It wasn't about Code 22F or state versus Randall. No, this was about Monroe. This was about his reign. This was about the very fabric of his power, and Jasmine was about to unravel it thread by thread. "I've reviewed over 24 of your rulings over the past 3 years," she said, her words measured and deliberate. "Would you like to know how many were appealed due to the denied hearings?" And just like that, Monroe flinched. The shock of the question hit him harder than he could have expected. His eyes darted briefly to the clerk, who had now set her pen down and was watching him with an intensity that made the room feel even colder, and then to the prosecutor, whose gaze flicked nervously between Jasmine and the judge. The silence around him deepened, suffocating him. Monroe was no longer in control of the room. The walls had started listening, and they weren't listening to him anymore. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't push. She simply continued, her calm voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. 12. 12 were appealed. 9 were overturned. She paused, letting the weight of the number settle. "Pattern recognition is important in law, Your Honor, and this courtroom is starting to see one." The words landed like a heavy thud, reverberating through the room. There was no denying it. Monroe's rulings were flawed, systemically, glaringly flawed. Jasmine had laid it all bare. And the best part, she didn't need to shout it. She didn't need to point fingers or call him a failure. She simply handed him the cold, hard facts. And those facts had already started to unravel him. Monroe stood up. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible at first, but in the context of the courtroom, it was seismic. Judges don't stand unless they have to. They remain in their chairs, towering over the room, embodying their authority with the simple act of sitting. But now, Monroe had broken that unspoken rule. He was up, adjusting his robe like a man trying to tighten armor that had long since lost its fit. He was trying to regain his composure, trying to reassert his control, but it was too late. "This hearing is adjourned," he barked, his voice a little too sharp, a little too defensive. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She didn't back down. She didn't yield to his command. Instead, she met his challenge with the same unwavering calm she had maintained from the beginning. "Not quite," she said, her voice still soft but no less powerful. "I'd like to formally submit this record into evidence, and I will be filing a motion for judicial review." Boom. That was it. The shot Monroe never saw coming. A motion for judicial review was a game changer. It meant exposure. It meant someone with more power, more authority than Monroe would come in and scrutinize everything he had done. Every rushed ruling, every skipped procedure, every instance of him silencing people who didn't fit his narrative. Sunlight was a fatal weapon against shadows, and Monroe had just been exposed to the harshest light imaginable. The motion for review meant that his decisions would be peeled apart, examined, and potentially overturned. It meant that someone would be forced to see the truth. And that truth, it was a nightmare Monroe couldn't outrun. As the judge stormed out, the door didn't just close behind him, it slammed. The sound of it echoed through the room, a loud final punctuation to the battle that had just unfolded. And for the first time in that courtroom's history, the silence didn't belong to the judge. It belonged to her. The stillness in the room was suffocating, but it was Jasmine's silence that held the room in its grip. It was the silence of victory, the silence of a woman who had outwitted a system that was stacked against her. It was the silence of someone who had just dismantled the very institution that had tried to break her. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett became more than just a lawyer. She became a force, a symbol of everything that had been overlooked, dismissed and underestimated, and no one would ever forget it. When the judge stormed out of the courtroom, he left behind a trail of confusion, unease, and disbelief. The air, once thick with tension, now hung heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. For a long moment, the courtroom was still, as if the very walls had been stunned into silence. The staff, the clerks, the bailiffs, everyone in that room had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Some exchanged uncertain glances. Others, visibly impressed, shook their heads in disbelief. They had just seen someone with the guts, the courage, to not only challenge a judge's power, but to take it apart piece by piece, with nothing but sharp wit and legal precision. But Jasmine Crockett, she didn't linger to savor the moment. She didn't stand there basking in the shock or the awe. She was already collecting her files, tucking them into her bag with the same smooth efficiency that she always exhibited. She walked with a grace that made it seem as though this wasn't anything extraordinary, just another day at the office. But inside, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, calculations, and preparations. She knew that Monroe wouldn't let this slide. A judge like him doesn't take a public defeat lying down. He had power, connections, and a massive ego. Retaliation was inevitable, but that was the least of her concerns. She had bigger things to focus on, much bigger things. As Jasmine walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking methodically against the floor, the weight of her decision to file a motion for judicial review began to settle in. It wasn't just about the case anymore. She hadn't just made an enemy. She had made herself a target. The ripples from her actions would affect far more than just her career. But Jasmine had learned long ago that when you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, something that could change the way things worked, you can't afford to fear retaliation. Not now, not ever. Her mind, always 10 steps ahead, began mapping out the next phase of her strategy. The motion for judicial review was only the beginning. She would gather evidence, make sure her team was prepared, and make sure that everyone knew exactly what was happening behind closed doors. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't even about the case. This was about exposing a system that had allowed unchecked power to fester for too long. She had the law on her side, but she needed something more. She needed the truth to be louder than Monroe's arrogance, and that meant a battle that would go far beyond the walls of a courtroom. Jasmine hadn't even made it to her car before the phone call started. Word had already spread like wildfire. The news outlets were hungry for the story. A black attorney standing up to a judge in his own courtroom, a judge with a history of questionable rulings and a reputation for silencing anyone who dared to oppose him. The story practically wrote itself. Her phone rang incessantly, the screen lighting up with notifications as her inbox flooded with messages. Journalists, eager to get the inside scoop, left voicemail after voicemail, calling for interviews. Social media lit up with people speculating, debating, sharing clips of the courtroom confrontation. Colleagues, friends, and fellow activists reached out in solidarity, some offering support, others asking how they could help. Jasmine didn't even glance at the messages. She knew the importance of the moment. She knew the kind of attention this was attracting, but this wasn't about the limelight. She wasn't in it for the fame or the headlines. She had one goal and one goal only: expose the truth, show the world what had been happening behind the scenes, and push for a change that could resonate through the entire system. But Monroe wasn't going to back down either. In the days following the hearing, the fight went public. Monroe, never one to shy away from defending his reputation, fought back with everything he had. He was angry, wounded, and determined to put Jasmine in her place. He called press conferences, issued statements condemning her actions, framing her legal challenge as nothing more than a personal vendetta, a baseless attempt to disrupt the system for her own gain. He called her tactics disrespectful, unprofessional, and unbecoming of a lawyer. But Jasmine wasn't about to let Monroe's taunts distract her. She knew what this was really about. Monroe's ego had taken a hit, and now he was doing everything in his power to regain control. It was about self-preservation for him. But for Jasmine, this wasn't about pride or ego. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that judges and everyone in positions of power were held to the same standard as everyone else. She wasn't fighting for personal glory. She was fighting for a change that could last. What Monroe hadn't anticipated, what he hadn't seen coming, was the tidal wave of support that Jasmine received in the wake of their confrontation. It started small, just a trickle, a few tweets, a handful of retweets from people in the legal community, but then it grew. Other attorneys, many of whom had been silently watching from the sidelines for years, reached out to her. They too had seen the problems with Monroe's rulings. They too had witnessed his abuses of power. Jasmine had become their voice. But it wasn't just the legal community. Everyday people, ordinary citizens who had never set foot in a courtroom, had watched the drama unfold on social media. They had seen the raw, unvarnished truth of what had happened in that room, and they were rallying behind Jasmine. The hashtags started circulating. God could justice for Jasmine, expose Monroe, power to the people. It wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a movement. Jasmine's phone rang again, and this time it was different. It wasn't a reporter or a colleague. It was a former judge, one who had retired early, frustrated with the corruption and lack of accountability in the system. He was calling to offer his support and his resources. He wasn't the only one. More former judges, activists, and legal professionals reached out, offering to help, offering to testify, offering any assistance they could provide. The support came in all forms: letters, donations, and yes, even private meetings to strategize. The more Monroe lashed out, the stronger the movement became. Jasmine had ignited something that could no longer be contained. She had gone from being a single attorney in a courtroom to becoming the face of a much larger cause, one that sought to shine a light on corruption, to dismantle the power structures that allowed people like Monroe to thrive unchecked. It wasn't just a fight for justice in this case. It was a fight for justice everywhere, and Jasmine wasn't going to stop until she had the truth on her side. As the days went on, Monroe's attempts to discredit her grew more desperate, but they had the opposite effect. With each passing day, Jasmine's voice grew louder. The tide was turning. Monroe's arrogance, once his greatest weapon, was now his greatest liability. And as more and more people stood by her, Jasmine Crockett realized something. She hadn't just taken on a corrupt judge. She hadn't just exposed one man's flaws. She had ignited a movement. She had become the spark that set fire to a long smoldering injustice. The fire was burning now, and nothing, no amount of power, no amount of intimidation, could put it out. The system was about to change, and Jasmine had just become the catalyst. The courtroom buzzed with an energy that had never been there before. The atmosphere was charged, and electricity crackling in the air as the story of Jasmine Crockett's legal battle took on a life of its own. The whispers were no longer contained within the walls of the courthouse. No, they had spilled into every corner of the city, igniting conversations in coffee shops, in offices, and across dinner tables. Jasmine's name was now a fixture in the headlines, plastered across every media outlet, and with it, Judge Monroe's iron grip on the court and his reputation began to slip. Monroe had built a career around the idea that he was untouchable. He had spent years in the courtroom as a force to be reckoned with, a man who made the rules, enforced them, and never let anyone forget who was in charge. He didn't tolerate disrespect. He didn't tolerate challenges. He wasn't used to losing control. Not in a courtroom, not in his career, not in his life. But Jasmine Crockett, she was a different breed. She wasn't just an attorney looking to win a case. She was a force, righteous, relentless, and unafraid. And as her name dominated the news cycle, Monroe's walls of authority began to crumble. The backlash came swiftly, and it came hard. Monroe had spent years operating in a system that shielded him from the kind of scrutiny most people faced. He had known the right people, made the right deals, and followed the right procedures to keep his untouchable image intact. But now the spotlight was squarely on him, and the cracks were starting to show. The news stories came like a tidal wave, relentless and unyielding. Reporters began digging deeper into his past rulings. They found patterns, dangerous ones. There were accounts of him pushing verdicts through without proper hearings, making snap judgments that disregarded due process, and silencing anyone who dared question his authority. His once untouchable image, carefully constructed over decades, began to crack. People were starting to ask questions that Monroe had long hoped would never be asked. But Monroe wasn't a man who would go quietly into the night. No, he was going to fight, and he was going to use every tool at his disposal. His first weapon was power, and he wielded it with the precision of a seasoned politician. Behind closed doors, Monroe began pulling strings, making calls, and rallying his allies in the court system. They circled the wagons, trying to isolate Jasmine, to diminish her influence, and to quash the movement that was quickly gaining momentum. They knew that if she continued gaining traction, she could become a threat not just to Monroe, but to the entire establishment. And they couldn't have that, not on their watch. Jasmine knew retaliation was coming, but she wasn't naive enough to think it would be anything but brutal. She knew how this system worked. She knew the ways in which those with power fought to keep it, even when they knew they were wrong. But she had already prepared herself for the worst. The very reason she had filed that motion for judicial review wasn't just to expose Monroe's wrongdoing. It was to set the stage for a legal war, a war that could shake the entire judiciary to its core. She had anticipated this. She had known that challenging a judge like Monroe wouldn't just mean standing up to him. It would mean taking on an entire system that had long been built on intimidation and silence. Monroe, however, was no rookie. He wasn't going to sit back and let his reputation be torn apart by a disrespectful young attorney. He had spent years mastering the art of defense. He knew how to use the system to his advantage, and he was ready to go on the offensive. His counterattack began almost immediately, and it was a carefully orchestrated barrage of legal tactics designed to discredit Jasmine and her cause. The first move was simple: file complaints against her. The accusations were serious: professional misconduct, breach of courtroom decorum, even unethical behavior. He painted Jasmine as an attention seeker, a troublemaker who had undermined the authority of the court for her own personal gain. He painted her as someone who didn't respect the system, who wasn't fit to practice law, and Monroe wasn't content with just attacking her in the courtroom. He launched smear campaigns, orchestrated rumors, and tried to poison the public's perception of her. His goal was clear: strip her of her credibility, diminish her standing, and turn public opinion in his favor. But Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She didn't back down. In fact, his attacks had the opposite effect. Each complaint he filed, each rumor he spread, only made her more determined. Jasmine fought back, not just with legal acumen, but with a quiet, unwavering resolve. Every time Monroe's attacks came, she turned them into opportunities to expose the truth even further. Every complaint he filed, every smear campaign he launched, was a chance for her to double down on her cause and shine an even brighter light on the flaws in the system. She used his own tactics against him, and when the media outlets caught wind of Monroe's retaliatory moves, they didn't back off. They escalated the story, amplifying every step she took, every move she made. The more Monroe fought, the more the media ran with it. What had started as a legal battle had quickly become an all-out war of perception, power, and truth. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for a case anymore. She wasn't just challenging a corrupt judge. She was taking on a system, one that had allowed men like Monroe to flourish without consequence, one that had fostered a culture of fear and silence for far too long. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for accountability. She was fighting for the very foundation of justice itself. She wanted to show the world that those in power couldn't be allowed to abuse their authority without consequence. This was bigger than her. It was about creating a system where no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. As the battle raged on, Jasmine's supporters grew in number. What had started with a small group of legal professionals and activists began to snowball into a larger movement. People from all walks of life, people who had watched the courtroom drama unfold on social media, began to rally behind her. There were lawyers, former judges, students, and even everyday people who had never set foot in a courtroom, but who knew that what was happening wasn't right. They saw this not as just a fight between one woman and one judge, but as a fight for justice, a fight for the integrity of a system that had long been corrupted. The backlash against Monroe was growing, and it wasn't just from the legal community. It was from the people. The ones who had been denied justice time and time again, the ones who had seen how easily the powerful could silence the voices of those who challenged them. They had found their voice in Jasmine, and they weren't going to let it be silenced. Monroe had underestimated the power of one woman's voice. He had underestimated the strength that comes from fighting for something bigger than yourself. And now he was learning the hard way just how dangerous it could be when that voice wasn't afraid to challenge the system. As the battle for justice escalated, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. The fight for accountability was far from over, and neither was Jasmine. The courtroom was electric, charged with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. For months, the drama surrounding Judge Monroe and Jasmine Crockett had captivated the public's imagination. What had started as an isolated case of legal injustice had escalated into a battle for the very soul of the justice system. And as the final showdown loomed, there was no telling who would walk away victorious or who would be left in the ashes. Monroe had always been the man in control. A seasoned judge with a reputation for being unshakable, he had weathered countless storms in his long career. His decisions were rarely questioned, and his authority rarely challenged. But now, for the first time, he was on the defensive. It wasn't just his reputation on the line anymore. It was his entire legacy. Every attack on his character, every misstep, had peeled back another layer of his once invincible facade. And then Jasmine Crockett had struck with a move that no one saw coming, a move that had the potential to expose Monroe's deepest secrets. The case Jasmine had uncovered, a seemingly forgotten legal dispute from years past, was like a time bomb ticking in Monroe's past. He had thought it buried, dismissed as insignificant, but Jasmine had the persistence and the brilliance to pull it from the shadows. In a moment of brilliance, she filed a motion to reopen the case, accusing Monroe of misconduct. The case was a textbook example of how Monroe had misused his judicial power to railroad an innocent defendant, a defendant who never stood a chance in Monroe's courtroom. Monroe, already reeling from the fallout of the media storm surrounding him, tried to discredit Jasmine's move. He dismissed it as a frivolous attempt to undermine the court's authority. But Jasmine was ready for his rebuttal. She had meticulously researched the case, digging into every detail until the truth could no longer be ignored. She wasn't just playing chess. She was strategically dismantling the entire structure that had protected Monroe for decades. As the motion made its way through the legal system, the pressure on Monroe mounted. His allies, who had once stood by him unwaveringly, were beginning to see the writing on the wall. They knew that if Jasmine succeeded, it would set a dangerous precedent for the entire judicial system. No longer could judges like Monroe act with impunity. No longer could they dismiss the rights of individuals without facing consequences. And the more the legal community rallied behind Jasmine, the more Monroe's grip on the situation slipped away. But Monroe wasn't going to go down without a fight. He had spent years building his reputation, and he wasn't about to lose it to a young attorney who had the audacity to challenge him. Behind closed doors, he pulled every string he could. He lobbied for support from powerful figures within the legal system, hoping to discredit Jasmine and protect his own position. He accused her of being a troublemaker, a woman out to make a name for herself at the expense of the truth. But Jasmine was unrelenting. She didn't back down in the face of his attacks. If anything, they fueled her fire. She continued to fight for what was right, using the very tools Monroe had tried to wield against her to turn the tide in her favor. She knew that the battle was no longer just about this one case. It was about the systemic corruption within the judicial system that had allowed men like Monroe to thrive without consequence. Jasmine was challenging an entire structure, and with each move she made, she was revealing its cracks, and the public was watching. As the media outlets continued to report on the growing scandal, the public's perception of Monroe began to shift. People who had once revered him now saw him as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. They saw a man who had abused his power, who had sought to silence those who dared to speak out. And in Jasmine, they saw someone who was willing to stand up, to risk it all for the sake of justice. As the hearing approached, the stakes couldn't have been higher. This was the moment of truth, the final showdown. The courtroom would be filled with media, attorneys, and supporters, all waiting to see how this would play out. Jasmine stood tall, poised and ready, knowing that this could be the moment that would define her career and the future of the justice system itself. When the day arrived, the courtroom was packed. News cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and the energy in the room was palpable. Monroe, once the towering figure of authority, now looked small. His usual air of arrogance had faltered, replaced by a nervousness that was impossible to conceal. The tables had turned. It was no longer Jasmine who was under scrutiny. It was Monroe. Jasmine rose to present her case, calm and composed, exuding the kind of confidence that only someone who had done the hard work could have. She walked the court through the case Monroe had tried to bury, the case that had exposed his corruption. With a steady hand, she laid out the facts, pointing out the flaws in Monroe's past decisions and how they had led to an innocent man's unjust fate. She was methodical, each word carefully chosen, each argument delivered with precision. This wasn't just a defense of one person. It was a defense of the very principles of justice that Monroe had trampled upon for so many years. Monroe, for all his fury and pride, could only watch as Jasmine dismantled his defense. His rebuttals were weak, his arguments unconvincing. For the first time in his career, it seemed as though he was losing the support of the very people who had once propped him up. The press, once enamored with his authority, was now turning its attention fully to Jasmine. Her words carried weight. Her actions spoke louder than anything Monroe could say in his defense. As the hearing continued, the tension in the room became unbearable. The crowd, the media, and the lawyers all knew that this was more than just a court case. It was a battle for the soul of the justice system. And in that battle, Jasmine was winning. Finally, the moment came, the moment when Jasmine, standing tall before the court, delivered the sentence that would echo in Monroe's ears for the rest of his life. He tried, one last time, to regain control, to silence her, to assert his dominance in the courtroom. But Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She wasn't afraid. With unwavering conviction, she faced him in the court and delivered the words that would forever mark the turning point. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "the time for silence is over." The room fell into complete silence. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and powerful. Monroe, once so certain of his own authority, now found himself powerless, exposed for the corrupt judge he had become. It was over. In that moment, Jasmine had not only won the case, but she had delivered a crushing blow to the system that had long protected people like Monroe. The public had seen the truth. They had seen the courage of a woman who refused to back down, who refused to let the system silence her, and in the end, they had seen justice prevail. The final showdown had come, and Jasmine Crockett had emerged victorious. The courtroom was a battleground, every inch of space filled with tension, anticipation, and the weight of history hanging in the balance. Jasmine stood in the center, poised, calm, and unshakable, her eyes never leaving Judge Monroe. The air felt thick with the reality of the moment. This wasn't just another case. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for: justice, integrity, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The stakes had never been higher, and the world was watching. Would this be the moment of reckoning for a corrupt judge who had thrived for far too long in the shadows? Monroe, once an untouchable force, now sat at the edge of his bench, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he fidgeted with the papers in front of him. His once imposing figure now seemed small and desperate. His gaze flicked nervously to the media cameras, to the eyes of the public who had once revered him, now waiting for his downfall. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and for the first time, the weight of his own arrogance felt like a suffocating burden. As the room watched in rapt attention, Jasmine's voice broke the silence. "Your Honor, I'm not here to win a case. I'm here to ensure that no one else ever suffers under the abuse of power you've inflicted. This isn't just about one defendant. It's about every person who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or ignored because they didn't have the power to fight back. This is about a system that needs to change." Her words hit with the force of a hammer. Each syllable carried the weight of years of oppression, every pause punctuated by the stillness of a courtroom that had been held in suspense for too long. Jasmine wasn't just speaking for herself or her client anymore. She was speaking for every marginalized person who had been crushed by a system that was meant to protect them but had failed time and time again. Judge Monroe's hands clenched into fists, his face reddening with fury. He opened his mouth to object, to silence her with the same authority that had once made his word law. But this time, there was a crack in his armor. "Your Honor," Jasmine continued, her voice steady and unwavering, "we are here today because of the corruption you've allowed to flourish within your court. You've abused your power, you've dismissed justice, and you've undermined the very principles this country was founded on." Monroe's rebuttals faltered. His usual sharp tongue was now dulled, his arguments weak and incoherent. The crowd, which had once viewed him as a symbol of authority, now saw him for what he truly was, a man who had been riding on the coattails of his own power, protected by the system that had allowed him to act without consequence. The room was no longer a place of intimidation. The courtroom had transformed into a stage, and Jasmine was the star, strong, resolute, and undeniable. She had prepared for this moment for years, and now every ounce of her preparation, her belief in the law, and her fight for justice came to life in a single decisive moment. "I'm not here to fight a legal battle," she said, her words carrying a weight that resonated through the walls of the courthouse. "I'm here to hold you accountable, and I will not stop until the truth comes to light." Monroe, desperate to regain control, tried once again to assert his dominance, but his voice was shaky, his arguments hollow. "This is frivolous," he muttered, but even as he said it, his words felt weak. The more he fought back, the more he seemed to unravel. He had spent years building a reputation of power, But Jasmine's relentless pursuit of truth had shattered that illusion. The room was silent as Jasmine's legal team stood behind her, their support unwavering. It was no longer just about the motion she had filed. It was about exposing the rot at the core of the justice system, the very system that had allowed men like Monroe to thrive unchecked. Jasmine had become the voice of reason in a world that had too often turned a blind eye to corruption. As the judge attempted to regain his composure, it was clear to everyone in the room that the tide had turned. Jasmine was no longer a young attorney who was fighting for a cause. She had become a symbol of hope for those who had been ignored, dismissed, and forgotten. The weight of public opinion, once on Monroe's side, now swayed heavily in Jasmine's favor. She stood tall, unwavering in her belief that justice would prevail. Her case was airtight, her arguments irrefutable, and the public support behind her. The courtroom had become a microcosm of the fight for fairness in a world that often seemed skewed by power and privilege. In that moment, Jasmine was no longer just fighting for one person, one case, or one courtroom. She was fighting for all of those who had been silenced by the very system that was meant to protect them. The judge's ruling came swiftly, too swiftly for Monroe to salvage his reputation. He had no choice but to step down. The court had no other option but to acknowledge the undeniable truth. Judge Monroe had abused his power, had failed in his duty to uphold the law, and had caused irreparable harm. His career, once a symbol of authority, now lay in ruins. Jasmine's victory was not just a legal one. It was a victory for all those who had been oppressed, all those who had suffered in silence. Her success was a testament to the power of one person, standing firm in the face of overwhelming adversity, armed with the truth and the will to fight. She had taken down a man who had been untouchable, and in doing so, she had become a beacon of justice in a world that desperately needed it. The media buzzed with excitement, with journalists praising Jasmine's courage and tenacity. Her name became synonymous with justice and integrity, and she was heralded as a trailblazer in the fight for a more equitable system. But Jasmine knew that this was just the beginning. She had started a fire, and now it was her responsibility to fan the flames, to continue the fight for justice in every corner of the legal world. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine's career soared to new heights. She was invited to speak at conferences, to appear on panels, and her name became synonymous with the fight for fairness. She had become a symbol of what was possible when one person stood up against the tide of corruption and demanded change. But for Jasmine, the true victory was not in the accolades or the fame. It was in the knowledge that she had made a difference. She had exposed a corrupt system, she had taken down a powerful figure, and she had given a voice to those who had long been silenced. Her legacy was forever changed, and the ripples of her victory would be felt for years to come. As for Judge Monroe, he was quietly relegated to the past, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. His downfall served as a reminder to all that no one, not even those in positions of power, was beyond the reach of justice. No, Jasmine Crockett had not just won a case, she had won a war. And as she left the courthouse that day, she knew that her journey had only just begun. There would always be more battles, more injustices to fight, but Jasmine was ready. She had already proven that she had the courage, the conviction, and the strength to take on anything the world threw her way. And with each victory, she would continue to change the world, one case at a time. Jasmine's story was no longer just hers. It was the story of anyone who had ever been oppressed, who had ever been ignored, who had ever been told they didn't matter. And as long as she breathed, that story would continue to inspire others to fight for what was right, to stand up, and to never back down.